All right, so this is Equitable Services to Independent Schools. Thanks again to folks who have joined and folks who are arriving. If you are not in the right session, feel free to tap out. You won't hurt my feelings. So topics for today. Well, first some logistics. Please be sure to mute yourselves. If you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat or raise your hand. You may or may not have those functions in your version of Teams. So if you need to, during a designated time for questions, go ahead and shout out and we'll try to address everyone's questions. It's going to be pretty quickly moving. We've got a lot to cover and I do want to leave time for questions at the end. So I may not spend a ton of time on questions sort of between sections, but as always, feel free to email me after the presentation. I'm always available to answer questions. So topics for today are going to be background, just a couple of slides on sort of the underpinnings of the Equitable Services requirements under ESSA, a conversation about who's eligible, which independent schools can take part, and then some sections about the process, beginning with outreach to those eligible independent schools, determining the amounts available to provide equitable services to those schools, the process of consultation with those schools to determine their needs and begin identifying activities to be implemented on their behalves. Some odds and ends about providing services. That'll be a bit of a hodgepodge of sort of some frequently asked questions or some important things for LEAs to know as they implement an equitable participation program. And finally, some questions. I've got a couple of FAQs identified and then your questions will be welcomed, of course. So a little bit of background. As you know, federal law allows that federal education aid be provided to kids who need it just generally. And that's regardless of whether they attend a public school or a nonprofit independent school. The feds don't discriminate. In several federal programs, I think IDEA has an equitable services, a set of equitable services requirements, and certainly the title funds that we're talking about today do. Little preview of the next point, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA or now ESSA, after its reauthorization, requires that eligible independent schools be invited to participate in Titles 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's coordinated by the LEAs, as you are probably painfully aware at this point, for better or worse. There are the two citations where you'll find information in ESSA about those two, about the requirements for equitable services under ESSA. So basically, long story short, LEAs that receive CFP funds, and that's every LEA in Vermont at this point, are obligated to facilitate the participation of independent schools that are eligible in taking part in these funds. So who's eligible? Well, as I previewed and as you've heard me say before, it's nonprofit approved or recognized independent elementary and secondary schools, and the approval or the recognition occurs at the state level. We've got a team headed up by Deb Ormsby and Pat Pallas-Gray, who sort of, I don't know exactly what the requirements are, what the application process is, but ultimately independent schools are approved or recognized. So it's those schools and also those that are nonprofit. This can include schools that are religiously affiliated. It's a question I get several times a year. You know, there's a Catholic school in the LEA or a Mennonite school. Do I need to provide equitable services? Yeah, if they meet those other two criteria of being nonprofit and approved or recognized. Again, the feds don't discriminate. You know, the question has roots in sort of the separation of church and state. I think through another lens, the feds don't want to deny funding to schools that are religiously affiliated, that are made available with public dollars. So there's sort of another lens of separating in the other direction. Standalone independent pre-Ks are not eligible. The funding formulas for CFP funds, including how they're earmarked for equitable services, begin with counts of students at age 5. So there's really no mechanism by which funds can be driven or made available for schools that just serve 3 and 4-year-olds. But if you do have a secondary or elementary independent school that meet the other criteria and happen to have a pre-K, and if someone is not muted, can you go ahead and mute yourself, please? If you are an independent school that serves other grade levels and also has a pre-K, and you're a school that's eligible for equitable services, you can actually serve your pre-K students and staff with these same funds. That's similar to what we see in our public schools. Again, K-12 drive the funds, but if you're serving pre-Ks in one of your elementary schools, if you've got an LEA-wide pre-K program, you can then use funds to serve those schools. So it's the same thing with independent schools. Yep.
We have a question from Lynn. Sure. Saying we have a standalone independent pre-K daycare on our list.
Boy, if you do, you shouldn't. Lynn, let's talk about that offline. I did a quick perusal of the most up-to-date list, the one that's linked here, and I didn't think I saw any schools that just featured a pre-K, but if you do, that's not a school that would be served, that would be eligible to be served. So I want to apologize quickly. I'm a little under the weather today, so if I start coughing or hacking or my voice gets kind of gross, I apologize in advance. Please just bear with me. So I shared a list of those eligible schools in February through email. There's also a link here. I know you don't have this PowerPoint in front of you. I will send it along either as a link when it's posted or embedded in the email, so you guys can access these slides with this link. All right, so kind of expanding on who's eligible for which funds. So again, generally nonprofit approved or recognized independent schools. Those within the LEA's boundaries are eligible for Titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now you see the asterisk next to Title I. We'll get to that in just a second because there are some secondary criteria for a school to qualify for eligibility for Title I. Title III probably caught a few folks' attention. If your LEA does not receive Title III funds, you are off the hook. You don't need to scare some up to serve your independent schools. Currently, only 6 LEAs take part in Title III. They meet the minimum requirements to receive a Title III allocation each year. Those LEAs are responsible for providing equitable services to independent schools under Title III. The rest of you are not. And then outside the LEA's boundaries, this has come into as kind of new news to some folks this year. Certainly on the state side, I'm getting better at some of these details. You are required to provide Title I to qualifying eligible schools beyond your boundaries. It's tricky. We'll talk about it a little further, but just know that within your boundaries, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and independent schools beyond your boundaries, potentially Title I. So we'll get right to that asterisk right now. So again, independent schools eligible to participate in Title I are schools that are both nonprofit and approved and recognized by the state. And then there's secondary criteria. They also need to be schools that enroll students who are residents of a Title I served catchment area or attendance area within the LEA. In other words, they would have attended a Title I served public school if they were not enrolled in this independent school. And they need to be from households that are low income. So essentially, for an independent school to be eligible for Title I, both within and beyond the boundaries of your LEA, they need to be nonprofit and approved or recognized. They also need to serve students who meet both of these criteria. So an independent school will not necessarily qualify if they don't serve students who meet these 2 criteria. So basically, Title I funds follow students. Now forgive that word a little bit. As we all know, LEAs maintain control of these funds, so you're not sending funds to any of these schools. But the point is that those students who are from low-income households and students who would otherwise attend a Title I public school, they drive equitable services allocations to independent schools, both within and beyond the LEA's boundaries. I'm sure some people are saying, well, how do we know, what those schools are, who those students are? And we'll get to that a little bit. The question I think I get often and anticipate here. It also means that an independent school can receive Title I funds from multiple LEAs. There should be an S on that word. So if I'm an independent school in LEA 1, but I serve students from LEAs 1, 2, and 3 who are from low-income households and would otherwise attend Title I schools, all 3 of those LEAs should reach out to me each year and say, hey, we think we owe you some participation in equitable services under Title I. Any questions in the chat right now or hands raised?
We seem to be good right now.
Okay. So a little quiz with the answers already filled in, which is the best kind, just to kind of drive home the point of who these independent schools that might be eligible are or which students might be eligible. So a 4th grader who lives in Coolidge School District attends Lakeview Christian Academy, a nonprofit independent school in a neighboring LEA. So sort of 3 sets of scenarios here. The first is the student's household is not low income, but she resides in the attendance area of a Title I served elementary school. So note that student would not drive funds to that independent school. She would not help them be eligible or be responsible for sort of any funds being available for them to participate under Title I. Second scenario, the student's household is low income, but she resides in the attendance area of a non-Title I elementary school. Again, note, she only has met one of the 2 criteria. And finally, the one that works, the student's household is a low-income household and she resides in the attendance area of a Title I elementary school. Yep. In that case, even though the school is outside of the LEA, a per pupil amount of Title I that this student represents should be made available for the participation of that independent school. So you've identified the schools eligible to participate. You know, on that list I send out, you know who the in-district schools are, those that will qualify for 1, 2, 3, and 4, potentially 1 or 3, definitely 2 or 4. And you've sort of done some of your homework to try to figure out who those LEAs are, or rather who those independent schools are outside of your LEA that may host students that drive Title I funds. So now you need to conduct some outreach. So outreach should occur, you know, in advance of you drafting your original CFP application for the coming year. Outreach is the responsibility of the LEA. That's another question I get a lot. And then it's usually followed up with, again, that same concern of, well, how do we know who these schools outside of the LEA are that are serving our Title I eligible kids? It can be challenging, and I don't have any real clean answer for you in terms of how you sort of organize your record keeping on the LEA side to keep track of where all these kids are headed each year. Independent schools have been encouraged to reach out to LEAs if they haven't been invited to participate in Title I and they believe that they enroll students who may be eligible from your LEA. I've got a session with independent school leaders on Friday where I'm going to cover a lot of this same material. So that's kind of a good heads up for folks. They may be getting more emails than usual about Equitable Services this year. And that's a point I'm going to drive home for them. You know, if you haven't heard from an LEA, particularly the LEAs, you know, outside of the LEA in which your school is located, you know, do some outreach on your own, you know, share some of the responsibility there. Any questions?
Jesse, back to Title I eligibility.
Yep.
We have a question in the case of, feedback, terrible.
Oh, sorry, I'll mute while you're talking, Karen.
No, I don't know if it's me or you. In the case of Title I, does the independent school need to demonstrate academic eligibility in order to receive the funds? You're still muted.
All right, better now?
I can hear you.
All right, let me get back to sharing here. Yep, it's a great question. And I think, you know, it's rooted in that idea of there sort of being, you know, 2 tiers of Title I eligibility that we're all familiar with in our public schools. The first is, you know, the students that sort of drive funds to the school, and those are the students who are from households that are low income. And then the second is the students who are sort of your caseload students, and those are not necessarily the same kids. Title I in a targeted assistance school eligibility to be served by Title I is based on objective educational criteria. It's not necessarily the same kids who are from households that are low incomes that drive the fund. So there's often overlap, as we all know. It's the same thing with independent schools. The students that are from low income households are going to be the ones that drive funds essentially to independent schools. The independent schools are then responsible for establishing a Title I caseload, just like folks who run targeted assistance Title I schools or LEAs have to do. You need to identify those kids you're going to serve based on educational criteria, and it's not going to be the same kids. So it's the same standard. Low income drives the funds, academic need, you know, makes a student eligible for service. All right.
There seems to be, does the AOE maintain a list of low-income eligible students? Sometimes the independent school numbers and the state numbers are different. Which ones do we use?
Yep, it's a great question. In past years, I have sent out what we have for low-income numbers for independent schools. Now, there's some issues there. Oftentimes, those numbers would be the subject of pretty fierce debate. Independent schools would say that they're inaccurate, and you know they probably often were. A lot of independent schools don't run federal child nutrition programs, so they would have blanks in those spots. You know, that's the data we collect, I think, as an agency. So, you know, maybe for 2/3 of our eligible independent schools, we wouldn't have anything to share with the LEAs. The federal statute, the DOE, gives LEAs and independent schools a lot of flexibility to figure out those numbers together. So the enrollment numbers, and we'll get to this, that are going to drive Title II and Title IV amounts, the low income numbers that are going to drive Title I amounts. You should be working closely with your independent schools to figure out agreeable numbers with them. And there are several different ways that you can demonstrate low income or you can collect low income status from independent schools. If they're running a child nutrition program, you can use those same FRL numbers that all folks in LEAs are using for their Title I targeting and ranking. There are other options. We'll get to those in a little bit, but long story short, I'm not going to send out independent school numbers. They caused more problems than I think solved. And the expectation is that LEAs work closely with independent schools to determine what their enrollments were in the past year, what their rates of low-income students were. All right. So I'll share a letter template. I've seen a lot of great invitation letters that, did I skip a slide? I did, I'm sorry. So outreach, you're going to send a letter essentially, and that could be an email. Some folks use certified letters just to, have a record that, the letter was received by the independent schools. Typically the communication will include an invitation to participate, a brief description of the funds for which the independent school is eligible. So you may have two letters, one for independent schools within your LEA and one for independent schools beyond your LEA who would only maybe qualify for Title I. An intent to participate section where the independent school will indicate, yes, I'd like to participate and consult with you around this, or no, we're not interested in participating this year. And then a reasonable deadline for response. I strongly encourage that, so you can move on with your application and you're not sort of beholden to an independent school that may not be quick to respond for months and months, or get interrupted halfway through your year by an independent school who is suddenly interested in participating. The questions come up in the past, an independent school has opened in my LEA mid-year. Do I need to offer them equitable services? Nope, you don't. So I will share a letter template. A lot of you have developed great letter templates that I've seen. I will send one out, like everything else I'm going to send out after this session, with just some boilerplate language that you can modify for outreach. And as I said before, some LEAs use certified letters just so they have a record that the independent school did in fact receive the invitation. A date stamped email, in my opinion, works just as well. There's nothing in statute that says how you need to keep track of this, but you're probably well served by documenting in one way or another that this outreach occurred. All right, any questions at this point?
There was just a question for communication, but I think you just covered that. So okay. Go.
All right. So you know who's eligible. You conducted some outreach. You're now going to determine Title II and Title IV amounts. Now, as you heard, there's some data collection that sort of needs to happen with the independent schools to make these determinations. You need to know about their enrollments. In the case of Title I, you need to know about the number of low-income students they serve and whether or not they're residents of your Title I attendance areas. That could be part of your outreach. You could ask that schools who are interested in participating provide you with those numbers up front in their response. That could happen during consultation. So these three sections, outreach, determining amounts, and consultation, are kind of interchangeable in terms of the order you do them in, because you are going to need to have some communication with the independent schools to really determine these amounts and figure these things out. So determining amounts under Title II and Title IV, these are the really easy ones. Again, Title II and Title IV are only available to those eligible independent schools within the LEA's boundaries. And the amounts available are based on total enrollment. I think there's been some conflating, oh, those students aren't low income, or those students aren't residents of my district. Do we need to provide 2 or 4 to those kids? Yep, it's based on the independent school's total enrollment. It doesn't matter what LEA those students live in. It doesn't matter if they're from low income households or not. It's purely your total enrollment, their total enrollment, and we divide up the funds proportionally. So just those 2 steps, you would determine the total enrollment of your public schools, the total enrollment of participating independent schools within your boundaries. Again, you're going to come to an agreement on what those numbers are through outreach or consultation, and then you're going to apply that total and those proportions to your yearly annual allocations of Title II or Title IV to determine how much to set aside. The GMS does this for you. It's in the Equitable Share tab, and there's a Title IIA participation tab and a Title II 4A participation tab within the Equitable Share section. The public schools is going to self-populate. The number of independent schools you're going to plug in after consulting with those eligible independent schools who want to participate within your LEA. It's going to give you a total number of eligible children. Basically, it's going to divide your annual allocation by that number. And that's going to give you a per pupil amount, and then that per pupil amount multiplied by the total number of kids enrolled in independent schools within your LEA is going to give you the amount you're sort of on the hook for providing equitable share. Any questions?
Yep. So there's lack of follow-up from independent schools and how to handle that in the CFP application.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that means, when you conduct outreach, schools that don't respond. Yep. Yes. Don't include them in your totals here. Essentially, this is a total of independent schools who chose to participate.
Jesse.
Yep.
That was my question. It's more, oh yeah, I'm interested in participating, and then crickets, and I can't. I don't have any information on a strategy to put in the CFP application, and yet they're saying that they want to participate.
Yep, and I would take that same approach, Paul, of setting those clear deadlines, saying, hey, I got your intent to participate. We would like to consult by this date in May. And if I don't hear back from you and we don't have a time to consult where you'll provide these numbers, that ship has sailed, as politely as you want to put it with folks.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I think just being really upfront and clear. You guys are under pressures to get these funds figured out, and you can't do that until you've got your independent school stuff sort of tied up with a bow. So yeah, be really clear on deadlines for outreach and response, and then be really clear on deadlines for consultation. Keep them reasonable, and that's all the law really gives us. Give a reasonable deadline, and you should be good to go.
You'll see there's a question about, is the pre-populated enrollment number in GMS based upon the October 1st census? And I can answer that question as yes, it is.
Yep. And I think a nice follow-up to that is the data that you use for your independent schools, both for the 2 and 4 calculations, for the 3 and for the 1. That's also going to be a point in time from the previous year, just like we use for our internal calculations.
One and more about the enrollment numbers. So the total enrollment of our public schools, and then the total enrollment number of our students enrolled in the independent schools, not the total overall number of students in the independent schools. So I think that's incorrect.
That is incorrect. So it is total enrollment. It does not matter if they're quote unquote your students or not, regardless of where the students reside, and it could be an LEA two states over. The amount of Title II or Title IV you ultimately make available for Equitable Services, so the enrollment numbers you use are based on total enrollment in those schools. Is that the question, Karen, essentially?
Yeah, and the difference, Lynn, is this is talking about equitable share for 2, 3, and 4. It's different than equitable share for Title I.
Yep. If you go back a few slides previously for folks who review after all is said and done, there is a bullet in there to kind of remind you that it's not based on low income status. It's not based on residence. It feels maybe sort of sketchy to folks. Why are we responsible for these schools? I think some are baked into how the allocations are determined. These students are considered, and LEAs, the amounts of 2 or 4 they receive includes these kids. So anyway, I can't speak to that to any great detail or degree of accuracy, but that's what we've got. It's based on total enrollment, regardless of where those kids live. And there's a second step, actually. So this, again, is still in the Equitable Share tab. It's in the Amounts by School sub-tab. The 2 cells at the top of these columns, those will populate based on that, based on this sub-tab, the participation sub-tab. It is then the job of the LEA to break out that total amount proportionally between the independent schools that wish to participate. So say, for example, you get 2 independent schools in your district. And total, they enroll 100 kids. Independent school 1 enrolls 80 of them. Independent school 2 enrolls 20 of them. You would take that total 2A allocation and you would send 4/5 of it to independent school 1, not send, sorry. I do that sometimes. Again, you maintain control of these funds. You would make 4/5 of it available for equitable services to independent school 1. You would make 1/5 of it available for equitable services to independent school 2. So your job is to take that total amount in that top cell and to break it out below proportionally between those schools based on the numbers that they've shared with you. Sorry. All right, determining Title III, we'll breeze through this one. Any questions?
Let's see. Independent school runs a summer program. Can students enrolled in those programs be counted in the total student count? Or, whoops, it just jumped, sorry. Or is it just for a student enrolled during a typical school year?
Boy, that's a great question. So my inclination is the latter, that, you know, an independent school that runs a separate summer program for you know, students that otherwise do not enroll in that school, I can't imagine they would count towards equitable services calculations. I don't know for sure. Will that person shoot me a note to follow up? Maybe giving a little more details or just reminding me, and I will dig into that further. That's a great question.
And then we have one other. In the past, I've had an independent school say that they are interested in participating in Title I, and there are at least one student who is low income. But then when it's all said and done, they have no students in need of academic support. How should we handle that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you still have to earmark those funds for that LEA. I think, or rather that independent school, sorry, again, a little under the weather today. They don't have students that meet the criteria of being academically eligible. You know, it really is sort of a two-tiered eligibility, and we sort of gloss over it in the previous slides. But I would think that if they don't have kids who meet eligibility criteria for service, they may have low-income students who would drive funds otherwise, but they don't have kids who are academically eligible. It doesn't meet the intent of Title I to then provide services to that school. Essentially, there's no students to be served or staff to be, you know, given PD to serve those students. So I would think that to write investments for them would not meet the intent of the law. So in that case, you would not be responsible for equitable services. It's really sort of two gates that need to be passed through. All right, determining Title III amounts. Really quickly, so it's similar. It's independent schools within the boundaries of your LEA. Rather than being based on total enrollment, it's going to be based on the total number of English learners, both in your LEA, in your public schools, and in the independent schools. And again, you're going to take that total, it's going to be applied to your total Title III allocation, and then you're going to divide it up proportionally. Something that I think prevents a lot of equitable share under Title III in those 6 LEAs that have Title III available to them is your independent schools who wish to participate, if there are any in Title III, they need to have sort of an industry recognized, a reliable method that they employed in the past year of identifying ELs, like the WIDA screener that we use in our LEAs. So if your independent schools are not able to kind of show you objectively, you know, in a standardized way that these students have been identified as English learners, then they will not be able to take part in equitable share under Title III. So just something to know, you know, if, let's say, Burlington of Christ the King reaches out and says, you know, we have 10 ELs that we wish, you know, and we wish to take part in equitable services under Title III, you can ask, you know, how are these students screened? How is English language eligibility determined in sort of an industry recognized standard way? It's the same deal. There's the sub-tab for Title III participation. Again, it's the difference here is it's going to be English language learners or English learners rather than total students enrolled. You're going to apply the total number of English learners between your public schools and your independent schools to the total amount of funds you receive that year. And you're going to get a per pupil amount and a proportional amount available for equitable services. And then again, I didn't show it a second time, but you're going to go to that same second tab and divide it out by hand proportionally to those independent schools that wish to participate based on the numbers they shared. Any questions about 2, 4, or 3?
Yeah, let's go back. Can we go back to the slide on Title II calculation, please?
This one, maybe?
Yep. So the question here is, under the Title II calculation line, B2 says administrative costs. Do we deduct these to arrive at a per pupil allocation rate?
Administrative cost.
I'm not sure where they're talking about either.
Yeah, this may be from an example I shared in the past. There's a federal table that looks similar to this, or a table that the DOE has shared as an example that looks pretty similar to this. And yeah, LEAs are allowed to take out a reasonable amount of administrative cost for the sake of running Title I, II, III, or IV equitable services. Yeah, maybe you can speak to this, or maybe this is something we can follow up on later. In terms of how that would work in the application, you know, we've got our con admin pools, we've got our indirects, you know, those sorts of things. I don't know how you would account for sort of an administrative reservation for the sake of running these equitable services programs. It is allowable though, and the feds don't give a ton of guidance about, you know, what does and doesn't represent reasonable. But it does allow for the LEA to reserve some amount in communication with its independent schools, you know, because anytime you sort of sets funds aside or reserve funds, you know, you really should be communicating with your independent schools because it affects their amounts. So it is something. Go ahead, Karen, sorry.
No, I don't believe there's any way to articulate that. So when you're filling out the final tab of this section, you would still make the allocation to the school. I guess you would record keep that you set aside, you know, a percentage of that or a dollar amount for administration. And
yeah, and Karen, then would your understanding be that should probably appear as an investment, you know, administrative funds for equitable services under your titles?
Yeah, you know, proportionally, it would be such a small amount. You would really have to have quite a bit of independence, or, you know, you could roll it into con admin, you know, and take it off the top. I think that would be the better place for it, because proportionally it would just be pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, I had that thought about rolling it into con admin. I mean, I don't know if this represents funds that you could use above and beyond sort of the limits for administrative set-asides. You know, it's not real clear in reading the non-regulatory guidance on equitable services from the feds. Something.
Reach out to us after, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, it's a great question though, and one we should follow up on, because this is extra work for you all. So if there's an opportunity to set aside some administrative funds, we want to make that available. All right. So Title III. All right, Title I, the sticky one. So remember, independent schools, both within and beyond your boundaries, may be eligible to take part. And there's, you know, those two levels of criteria. It needs to be a nonprofit school. It needs to be a school that's approved and recognized by the state. And also it needs to enroll students who meet those criteria of being from low-income households and also residing in a Title I served catchment area in the public LEA. So as you imagine, then the total amount of Title I funds available for equitable services to a school is based on those students that meet that criteria. So those that reside in a Title I attendance area and those that are low income. So here's what you've got to do. You got to determine through targeting and ranking the schools that you're going to serve with Title I in the coming fiscal year in your upcoming CFP application. You're going to determine the number of children from low income households who reside in those attendance areas you've identified to be served by Title I, who are going to attend those public schools, and the number who are going to enroll, or who have been enrolled in independent schools who also reside in those attendance area. And again, you're going to need to work with your independent schools to kind of come up with these numbers. Sort of like 2 and 4, you're going to apply those proportions to your annual allocation of Title I, not including carry forward, to determine the total set aside amount. Here's a slide that might illustrate that a little bit to maybe get ahead of questions. You know, in this example, you've got 4 public schools that have been identified as the LEA to be served by Title I. You've then identified the number of low-income kids who will be served by those public schools, and sorry for the non-student first language there, the number of students from low-income households who are going to attend independent schools, but who otherwise reside in those Title I attendance areas, to give you a total number of low-income students. You're going to apply that number to your total amount of Title I funds to come up with proportionally what's available for your public schools and what is available for equitable services. So in this case, 90% for your public schools and 10% available for independent schools eligible for Title I service. Any questions about that?
We don't have a question about that, but we do have a question going back to Title III eligibility. Is the LEA responsible for determining EL eligibility services using the WIDA screener, or does the independent school need to determine the eligibility?
So to determine the eligibility of individual students as ELs, that is the independent school's responsibility. And again, if they are unable to do that or haven't done that in the past year, using sort of a research-based, recognized, standardized tool for identifying English learners, such as the WIDA screener, then they are not going to be able to participate. You need to be able to demonstrate that these students have been identified as ELs, using a reliable tool.
The next question has to do with the difference between A and R on the list of eligible schools. So that's approved and recognized schools.
Yep.
And they both are eligible to receive.
Yep, for our purposes, they both count.
And then one additional question, can an LEA ask for documentation of low income data from an independent school? Yes.
Yep, that's totally acceptable. And in fact, I would even say encouraged, to make sure you're sort of holding up your end of the bargain statute-wise. All right, so those sort of two steps I just described, figuring out who your public or your students who are from low-income households who are served by a Title I eligible school are, and then figuring out students from low-income households who would otherwise attend that school but attend independent schools. That's available in targeting and ranking in step 1A. That's where those numbers are going to come from. And GMS goes ahead and it calculates the equitable service amount for Title I based on what you plug in to these two columns. Well, I guess, the public low income column is populated based on that census from October. The independent low income you're going to populate based on conversations with independent schools and then them sharing with you the addresses of those students. So you know where to plug each kid in. So you're going to fill out that table in step 1A of targeting and ranking, and then GMS is going to go ahead and calculate an amount of Title I reserved for equitable services.
After you determine who you're going to serve so that it can exclude those if necessary.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, you're going to do your targeting and ranking to figure out what those Title I served dependencies are. And then again, the number of students from low-income households who attend those schools and the number who would have otherwise attended who are from low-income households but are attending an eligible independent school. All right, so consultation. Any other questions, Karen?
Nope, good.
All right, how are we doing on time? Oh, not too bad. So consultation, the next big step. They've conducted outreach, who is eligible to participate, who wants to participate. You've had some conversations about data, maybe. You can also have that conversation during consultation. And you may or may not have determined amounts. It's helpful to have those amounts in hand, that you're going to make available for equitable participation of an independent school. So you can really begin planning services and activities. It's hard to sort of plan the scope of these things without knowing just how much money is available. So you may want to talk about money and you may want to talk about data and you may want to determine amounts available before you consult. The consultation is required under statute. Essentially, it's collaborating with the eligible independent schools who wish to participate in order to design and develop their program. It needs to be timely and meaningful. So what is timely? Well, it needs to happen before the LEA makes any decisions about the funds available, essentially. So before you transfer, before you consolidate, before you do your set-asides, you need to do your consulting with independent schools because, again, the amount of money available under 1, 2, and 4, that impacts sort of what their proportional amount is going to be. So if your goal is to dump all your 2 into your 4, you need to talk with them first and you need to make them aware and sort of consult with them about how it impacts their needs. And and before the LEA makes any decisions about activities. So don't go and write investments for independent schools before you talk with them. And then what is meaningful? Well, as you'd imagine, everyone around the table has an opportunity to express their views and have them be heard. So independent school leaders and LEAs. Ultimately, the LEA is going to make decisions about how strategies are implemented, how the independent schools' needs are going to be met. The LEA, as we're going to touch on a little bit further down the road, the LEA is responsible for running these programs, for procurement, for purchasing, for employing staff or contractors to make these things happen. So ultimately, it's the LEA's decision. So just generally consultation topics, the needs of the eligible private schools, or I should say independent schools, and how they were identified, what services the LEAs will offer to meet those needs, sort of the logistics there, the how, the where, and the when, and by whom the services will be provided, and then how the efficacy of the program will be assessed. That is a requirement. LEAs should be collecting from independent schools at the end of the year evidence that the program was effective or not effective, to guide future decision making. Any questions?
We're good at this.
Okay. So as you'd imagine, Title I makes it a little hairier, as with most things. You're going to talk about that data if you haven't already. So how many independent school students reside in an LEA's attendance area that is served by Title I? So you're going to need addresses. You're also going to need to know, of those students who reside in one of your Title I served attendance areas, how many of them are from households that are low income. So as I sort of alluded to before, I'm sure very unclearly, you can use the same low income measure that the LEA uses, and that's provided that the independent school runs a federal child nutrition program, and that's FRL really across the board in our LEAs. You can use a comparable data source. It could maybe be tuition assistance applications to the independent school. It could be a parent income survey that the independent school does yearly. So long as you feel it's comparable, that it yields results that are probably similar to what FRL strata would yield. You can also use proportionality. You may have concerns about this. If you've got an independent school that tends to serve a very affluent population, maybe you don't want to use proportionality. Maybe it's not going to be fair. But this isn't a case probably where an independent school simply doesn't have low-income data. And what you can do is you can assume that the independent school students who reside in a Title I served attendance area experience the same rate of poverty as the public school students. So let's say school A in your LEA is 40% students from low-income households. Well, students from school A who rather attend an independent school, you can assume that those 10 students, if the rate of poverty in the school A attendance area is 40%, you can assume that 4 of the 10 students that attend the independent school are also going to be from households that are low income. So basically applying the proportion or applying the low income rate of the attendance area that those students are coming from. And there's a little example down here that's probably a little clearer than what I just said. All right, you should definitely be documenting consultation. It's required under statute, and as most of you experienced this past year, it was collected in GMS in the fall, and it's going to continue to be collected in GMS in the fall. And what you're going to document is either that consultation occurred, and in the consultation document, independent schools are going to sign off that it occurred and that it was meaningful and timely, and they're satisfied with the results. It's going to be a signed affirmation of an independent school choosing not to participate. Or you're going to document on that same form that you tried to reach out, this is how you reached out, and this is when you reached out, but you didn't hear back. I have, I think, sent your way a couple of times now the documentation of consultation form that everyone needs to use going forward. It basically meets all the statutory requirements. It's pretty clean and simple and easy. It makes it easy to review if we sort of have one uniform way that this is done. So please plan to start using that form going forward. And I'll send that out again with everything else I send out post this session. Any questions?
We're good.
Okay. All right, providing services. And then this is going to kind of be a hodgepodge, as I mentioned before. So activities, after you consult with independent schools, the activities that you sort of land on that you're going to provide using their equitable share of funds are going to be written in the CFP applications, just like investments for your public schools, and budgeted in the same ways. Same standards apply of being allowable activities, reasonable, necessary, allocable, and supplemental. So those same standards that you work with when writing your public school investments. As I mentioned a couple of times already, LEA is going to maintain control of the funds. You're going to maintain title to the materials, the equipment, and the property purchased. Independent schools receive services or are temporarily in possession of materials. They don't receive funds, and they have no authority to spend. Reimbursement is not allowed. I know there was an exception this year, which was made for the ESSER funds. You were allowed to reimburse for allowable cost going back to March. That is not true of CFP funds. You cannot reimburse. So you are responsible for, as I said before, procurement, purchasing, implementing services. This is all you. You cannot pay independent schools back for doing these things. And again, the LEA plans, designs, and implements the program, and this can't be delegated to the independent school. We've had some friction in the past between LEAs and independent schools where they said, oh, we didn't honor their request because they didn't follow procurement expectations of the LEA. And well, that's not the independent school's job. So be sure you're doing all of that planning and implementing of these activities. Any questions?
We're good at this, guys.
Okay. So I don't know why I put personal services. So interventionist, coaching, consulting, or counseling rather, they need to be provided by an employee of the LEA or by a third-party contractor. We do not hire independent school employees, essentially. So let's say you've got a Title I interventionist that's going to be with an independent school or independent schools for 0.2 FTE a week or a year. That needs to be an LEA employee. Or that could also be an equal or an equitable amount of service provided by a contractor. And services for private school children or independent school children should begin at the same time as services for public school children. That's as specific as the law gets. But if you've started your Title I interventions in your public schools in late August after identifying the eligible kids, that's when they should start in your independent schools as well. So odds and ends about equipment and supplies. You can place equipment and supplies in a private school for the period of time needed for the program and only for the program. They do not have to be under lock and key. They don't need to be returned to the LEA at the end of each week. You may want to slap a label on it that says, for Title I purposes only or for Title IV purposes only. That's quite all right. You don't even need to collect materials at the end of the year. They can stay with the independent school so long as they're being used for the purpose of the program under which they were funded. That can include beyond the period of performance for the grant. So let's say you get an independent school that you sent a couple of laptops to for whatever allowable reason. In 2 years or at the end of the year when the period of performance for the grant has ended, they can continue to use those laptops for the same purposes so long as they continue to use them for the same purposes. You don't need to run over there, right at the end of the year and collect them. Ultimately, though, those are your materials and supplies and equipment. So you do need to inventory them. You do need to make sure they're being used for the appropriate purposes. You ultimately, need to follow Uniform Grants guidance for dealing with them sort of the end of their program life. Materials need to be neutral, secular, and non-ideological. So like I said, we can provide services in schools that are religiously affiliated, but the services or materials we provide cannot be. Questions?
We have a question regarding eligibility, and this has to do with whether or not we reach out to schools in other states, such as New Hampshire.
Yep, great question. That's one of the frequently asked questions. So this would just be Title I, obviously, because they would be outside of your LEA's boundaries. And yes, you do. These are federal programs. They follow the same rules from state to state. So the state lines, really sort of don't come into play here. So if you're, right on the border of Massachusetts and, 10 of your kids attend a school, across the state line in Massachusetts, that's a nonprofit. Yep, you may be on the hook for Title I services and you should be conducting outreach. All right, professional development. You can pay stipends directly to independent school teachers for participating in PD activities. And, the most logical example is if they participate on the weekend or after school hours. Yep, you can pay them stipends. And actually, you would pay them directly to the independent school teachers. You wouldn't pay them to the independent school to provide. You may not pay for subs. There's some federal idea there of not sort of subsidizing independent school salaries. So, if an independent school wants to send someone to a PD activity during the school day, you may not pay for that person's substitute. And again, PD activities, just like supplies, they need to be neutral, secular, and non-ideological, at least the portion funded by the grant. Now, there might be situations where an independent school employee goes to, the Catholic School Conference for math instruction. You could pay for, let's say, the 2 sessions worth of registration that are just focused on math pedagogy. You cannot pay for the 2 sessions that are focused on connecting math instruction to Christian doctrine. So sort of important to know those details. Obligation of funds. So funds should be obligated in the year they're received. Generally speaking, we should not be carrying forward funds that are available for equitable services. There may be extenuating circumstances where you couldn't spend down the funds, where the independent schools couldn't hold the activities. I think this past year might be a great example. In those cases, which are sort of frowned upon but allowed, you need to reserve the specific amount of funds that were not obligated or were not expended towards that independent school's equitable participation. You would carry that forward for those specific independent schools for the coming year. Any questions?
We're good at this time.
All right, so as I mentioned before, independent schools who receive Title I funds need to operate as targeted assistance programs, so they're going to identify a caseload. It may not be the same students who drove the funds, the low-income kids. These are kids with academic needs based on multiple objective educational criteria. So sort of 2 dates there, and the question was asked before, and now that I think on it a little more, I know this answer because I've heard it shared with me before. You're absolutely right. Low-income kids, and again, student first language, I apologize, but students who are low-income may drive funds to an independent school, but if there are no kids who are eligible to be served for lack of academic need, then really there's no way to write activities for those schools. They wouldn't meet the intent of the funds. Okay, LEA of Residence is responsible for providing Title I services for its eligible students, so the students who would have otherwise attended your public schools. What happens in a lot of cases, because as we know now, a single independent school may be receiving, or rather may be eligible for equitable participation under Title I from multiple LEAs, is that often an LEA will act as a lead LEA, and that's typically the LEA in which the independent school is located. They're going to be working with that independent school anyway, around Title II and IV and possibly III. So often they will be willing to sort of coordinate the consultation, to write the activities in their CFP application on behalf of all of the LEAs who are on the hook for Title I equitable services to that independent schools. So that's going to require some coordination. It may feel unfair. You may not be willing to do it. There's nothing in statute that requires you to do it. It's maybe a nice courtesy to your neighboring LEAs. It's probably easier for the independent school because they're not consulting with 3 or 4 LEAs. They're not dealing with 3 or 4 different activities or 3 or 4 different personal service providers. So that's something that you can do as an option. And what would happen in that case is, the LEAs would communicate, LEA B would tell LEA A, who's acting as a lead LEA, listen, I've got 3 students worth of Title I available for this school, representing $6,000. Would you handle the services? Would you handle the consultation? And basically I'll cut you a check for $6,000. And of course your business office will have a better sense of exactly how to do that. All right, so questions. There's that first one, outreach across state lines. Yep. Independent schools where students are placed by the LEA, including students eligible for special education. Yep. In the past, some concerns been expressed about double dipping. I think locally, can students who are eligible for special ed participate in Title I? Yep, they absolutely can. 2 different funding sources, 2 different intents. And yes, those schools can also participate. Another big one that comes up, my LEA doesn't operate a high school, and you can fill in, other grade levels as needed, but most commonly it will be a high school. Do Title I funds still follow our high school age students to eligible independent schools within and outside of the LEA for Title I? Nope. Those students don't meet that criteria of residing in the attendance area of a public Title I served school. And actually ESSA provides a definition for attendance area. And basically it means a school they would have been able to attend. So if you've got a high school kid who resides in the attendance area of a Title I elementary school, that doesn't qualify. That's not a school that would serve that student. So nope, they wouldn't meet the criteria for funds to follow them to an independent school. And that is what I've got. As you probably know, I'm the ombudsman, so equitable services are my responsibility. If you've got questions or concerns, I'm the person to reach out to, and my job is to sort of ensure that requirements are being met. on behalf of both you and the independent schools. All right, that was a bit of a whirlwind. Thanks for bearing with me. Are there questions?
Yeah, we have a question. It's back to eligibility again. And who is responsible for determining academic need?
So determining academic need. So the independent school is going to determine what those criteria are, and that should be communicated to the LEA during consultation. So in terms of, as you might imagine, independent schools, use different numbers of standardized tests, different ways of assessing student progress. That's allowable. But the LEA should confirm with the independent school that they do in fact have a methodology for establishing who those kids are as part of consultation.
Can you see the question?
Yep, I'm up. Yep, good question, Jen. So yeah, the invitation went out a few weeks ago. It's on Friday at 9 o'clock. Yeah, I'd love to encourage the independent school vote. Yeah, that'd be great. You absolutely do encourage them. It went out to a listserv that one of our public relations folks, Kate Canizzo, maintains for independent school leaders. And I've received some follow-up from those schools, so it sounds like folks are aware. But yeah, absolutely encourage them. The more folks who attend, the better. I mean, obviously, it's to everyone's benefit when we've got informed partners in this work, for sure, and will benefit the kids ultimately. Lori, I don't believe that would be considered a subgrant. This isn't my cup of tea. You business office folk and maybe the Bob Kothups, Abby Hools and Cassandra Ryans on our side would be best fit to answer that. My understanding is that it's been written more as like a contract, but I don't want to say too much and get myself in trouble here because I'm really not sure. So it's a great question and one I'll follow up on, or maybe folks can follow up on with Bob or others on that team. Couple more minutes. Other questions? All right, that was a whirlwind. Probably clear as mud at some points, but I will send out more resources. Thanks so much for bearing with and for being so involved and for attending today and for everything else you've been handling this year and in other years. Very much appreciated. And thanks so much for working closely with independent schools on this. I know it's yet another thing you've been asked to do. So great job, and I really appreciate it. And I know they do too. And please reach out for follow-up, as often as you need. All right, all. Thanks so much.